Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you here. A special day as we remember Mother's Day. No, I'm all right. There we go. I want to speak this morning on raising godly children in an ungodly age. Now, I don't have to speak about the latter part of that title. We all know that we live in an ungodly age, and I don't really have to say too much about it. But raising godly children. Now, I know that deep down inside, it's the heart cry of every mom that's here today and that's listening on Zoom, that their children would grow up to be godly children. Ones that love and honor and serve God, and that just live their lives for God with godly values. Well, that's what I'd like to speak about today. A boy was sitting with his parents at a prayer meeting in Fremont, Michigan. And his mother gave him a piece of paper and pencil to busy him so that he could draw some pictures and print words, whatever he wanted to do. And after a while, he poked his mother and he whispered, kind of in a stage whisper, loud enough so that several around could hear. How do you spell sex? Now, shocked, thinking that he had used a three-letter word beginning with S and ending with X, she replied, "What did you say?" And the boy said, "You know, how do you spell sex? As in insects." And sure enough, she looked down on the paper and he had drawn a bug and wanted to write the word insect. But sometimes our children and grandchildren scare us. And especially when we're trying to raise them in a culture which is stealing away their innocence at a younger and younger age every year. The school, the internet, movies, literature, even popular music lyrics expose them to corruption at a very young age. And we live in an ungodly age, and it's getting harder and harder to raise children and grandchildren with godly values. And yet, I still believe it's doable. We can raise godly children in an ungodly age, and an Old Testament mother shows us how. She raised a boy that God used to bring the nation of Israel out of one of the darkest periods of their history. It was the period known as the Judges, and you can read all about them in the book of Judges in the Old Testament, when Israel time and time again turned away from the Lord their God. The scripture says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And what was right in their own eyes was far from God's moral code as to what was right and what was wrong in his eyes. And in addition, the nation was overrun by terrorists. Foreigners would invade the land and plague them. But even so, even in those desperate times, a mother was able to raise a boy that God used to revive that ruined nation. He became Israel's last judge and first prophet, growing up to be a godly man with a godly influence on a godless nation. And so, do you want to know how this mother did it? And how you can do it today? Well, that's what I want to talk about. And since today is Mother's Day, I want you to see how it was done in 1 Samuel chapter 1, where we meet Hannah and her son Samuel. The chapter begins like this. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah in the region of Zuph in the hill country of Ephraim. He was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph of Ephraim. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah, which means to be pitied, and Peninnah, which means a jewel. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Now, Hannah was certainly someone to be pitied, just like her name implies. She came from an obscure little village 15 miles north of Jerusalem. It was just a wide spot on the road. One of those towns where you blink and you're through it. How in the world could anyone from such a little town have any significant influence on an entire nation? And then on top of that, Hannah had no children, which was considered a curse in her day. God had cursed her because he had not given her any children. And to make things worse, her husband brought a jewel of a woman into the home named Peninnah, whose name means jewel, so he could have children through her. Now, it all was legal. The custom of the day allowed it. But can you imagine how Hannah must have felt? Her husband bringing another woman into the home just so he could share her bed. And at the very least, Hannah was unhappy about all of this. Probably, if the truth were told, inwardly she would want to have murdered Elkanah, as well as his second wife, Peninnah. But for sure, she felt violated and victimized. Whatever the case, this home was dysfunctional, although even on the surface, it looked like it was very religious. Look at verse 3. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Heaven's armies at the tabernacle there. The priests of the Lord at that time were two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. Now, did you notice that, the latter part of that verse? The Lord closed Hannah's womb. This was no accident of nature. It was an act of God. The God who causes all things to work together for good to them who love him, according to his purpose. And so God had closed Hannah's womb for his own good purposes. He was using the hammer and chisel of pain to fashion a woman who could raise a national hero, a man that would have an insignificant impact on the entire nation. Verse 6. Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Peninnah, Elkanah's other wife, taunted and provoked Hannah so much that she would literally shake. She trembled with rage under this provocation. Verse 7. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. And each time Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. Why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah would ask. Why aren't you eating? Why are you downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than 10 sons? Now, apparently, Elkanah didn't seem to understand Hannah's pain. She was a woman with deep emotional pain. She was barren. She was despised. She was taunted by this rival wife. She was victimized by circumstances that were out of her control. And it hurt deeply. But sometimes that is what it takes to raise a child who will change the world. Sometimes it takes a parent in pain. Sometimes it takes a mother who has been shaped and molded by hard times in her life. Sometimes it takes a woman who has learned to thrive in the midst of adversity. Scott Larson is president of Straight Ahead Ministries. And this ministry works with juvenile offenders all across the United States. And he tells the story of a woman who discovered God in the midst of her suffering. Annette and her husband were missionaries in Western Europe when she began to have pain in her back. The pain became so unbearable, she could no longer function, even with muscle relaxants. And x-rays revealed a tumor the size of a grapefruit that had attached itself to her spinal cord. Now, although surgery was going to be done immediately, the operation was considered somewhat routine and not particularly a high-risk procedure. But something went wrong. And Annette woke up from the surgery paralyzed from the neck down and in constant excruciating pain. Not long afterwards, she and her husband and their 5 children returned to the United States where she could be cared for in more appropriate surroundings. And several years after this, Annette's husband invited Scott to their home for Sunday dinner. Now, Scott had always admired Annette's testimony, having heard how that she had refused pain-numbing medications so that she wouldn't be numbed to all of life. Yet he wasn't sure what to expect from the visit. Would she be bedridden? Would they only be able to communicate for a few minutes and then she would have to get some rest? Well, what Scott encountered when he entered their home was a beautifully dressed woman whose outward expression revealed little of her inward physical pain. And during their 5-hour visit, Annette served as a gracious hostess who shared her story with honesty. She told how that when she first came out of surgery, she and everyone else, all their friends, focused on praying to God to heal her. But when that didn't happen, and she was confined to 24-hour care at home, she became very depressed. And most people stopped connecting with her. Their lives moved on, while Annette's came to a screeching halt. Bible college and missionary training had not equipped her to deal with a life that would be tied to a wheelchair and filled with constant pain. I felt I was left with 3 choices, Annette said: to kill myself and end the unbearable suffering for all of us, to abandon my faith in God and merely exist on painkillers, or to put my energies to discovering God in the midst of all of my suffering. Annette's face beamed. She said, I chose the third. And I began slowly reading the Bible, she said, through the lens of pain and suffering. And what I saw was a God who was familiar with both pain and suffering. I thought my pain and suffering had taken me to a place where God could never be found, she said. Instead, it was a place where he became more real to me than I had ever known him to be. Moms, choose to discover God in the midst of your pain. Like Hannah, take your bitterness to the Lord and tell him all of your troubles. because that's what Hannah did. After years and years of just being depressed and angry and taunted by this rival wife, she finally brought her troubles, her bitterness, her anguish to the Lord. Verse 9. Once after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow or this promise. O God of heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. Now, Hannah promised God that if he would give her a son, a boy, she prayed specifically, that he would be a Nazirite all of his life. Now, that's what she meant when she said that his hair would never be cut. A Nazirite in the Bible was someone who never cut their hair as a sign of their extreme commitment and dedication to the Lord. In other words, Hannah did not want a son for herself. She wanted a son for the Lord. She wanted to raise a son who would love, honor, and serve the Lord all his days. And so she prayed unselfishly. And she prayed unceasingly, verse 12. As she was praying to the Lord, Eli watched her. Seeing her lips moving, but hearing no sound, he thought that she had been drinking. You must not come here drunk, he demanded. Throw away your wine. Now, Hannah was so distressed and so distraught over her condition that it must have looked like she was drunk. You can just picture her rocking back and forth in anguish as she poured out her soul to the Lord, talking to him, but not audibly. Her lips were moving, and God could see the pain that she was in. And God heard her plea, verse 15. Oh, no, sir, she replied, I haven't been drinking wine or anything stronger. But I am very discouraged. And I was pouring out my heart to the Lord. Don't think that I'm a wicked woman. I have been praying out of great anguish and sorrow. In that case, Eli said, go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the requests you have asked of him. Oh, thank you, she exclaimed. Then she went back and began to eat again, and she was no longer sad. Now, Hannah had finally left the burden of her soul and heart with the Lord. She prayed unselfishly. It's for you, Lord, that I want this. She prayed unceasingly. She just kept at it. And she prayed with an unshakable faith that God heard and answered. You see, she prayed and she didn't stop praying until she had the assurance that God heard her and would answer her. And then God did hear and answer her prayer, verse 19. The entire family got up early the next morning, and they went to worship the Lord once more. When they returned home to Ramah, when Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea, and in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Samuel in the Hebrew, Shema'el, literally means heard of God. Hannah prayed unselfishly. She prayed unceasingly. She prayed unshakably. And God heard her prayer. So do you want God to hear your prayers? Then you need to pray like Hannah prayed. You need to pray unselfishly because God doesn't answer selfish prayers. Look at this in James chapter 4 and verse 3. He says, when you ask in prayer, you do not receive because your reasons for asking are wrong. You want those things only to please yourself. You see, you don't pray just to get your own selfish desires. Instead, you pray unselfishly. You pray for God's will. You pray for God to be glorified. You pray for God's kingdom to be advanced. Furthermore, you need to pray unceasingly. You don't quit until you're sure that God has heard and will answer, until He brings peace to your heart. That's what the saints used to call praying through. You pray through till you know God has heard. Jesus told His followers in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, they should always pray and never give up. Now, those are Jesus' words. He says, always pray and don't give up. An old Haitian believer put it this way in her prayer, Lord, don't let us put our load of trouble in a basket on our head. Help us to put them on Jesus' head. Then we won't have headaches. And that's what the Bible says. Cast all your burden upon the Lord because He cares for you. If you want God to answer your prayers, you pray unselfishly, and you pray unceasingly, and you pray with unshakable faith. Pray with a sure and certain confidence in the Lord, who delights in giving good gifts to His children and whose will is always best. Look at this in Hebrews 11:6. It is impossible to please God without faith. Did you get that? It's impossible. You want God's blessing, you want God's answers. It's impossible if you don't have faith. Anyone who wants to come to Him must believe that God exists and that He rewards those who sincerely seek Him. You come with unshakable faith. Dr. Ben Carson is a world-famous brain surgeon, as well as former head of the United States Housing and Urban Development. He performed more than 400 brain operations a year in the height of his medical career. Now that's miraculous when you consider his background. Dr. Carson credits his faith and his mother for the success that he has enjoyed over the years. He said of his mother, she was one of 24 children. Did you get that? 24 brothers and sisters in the same home. She obviously didn't get much attention. She got married at the age of 13. Did you get that? Married at the age of 13. She found out that her husband was a bigamist, and he abandoned her after she had 2 children. She only had a 3rd grade education, and she had to raise these children on her own. But she never adopted a victim's mentality. Oh, woe is me. I'm going to depend on the government. The government owes me all this money and owes me this and owes me that because of my circumstances. No. She prayed. And she asked God to give her the wisdom that she needed because her 2 boys, which she had to raise by herself, were terrible students. And God heard the prayer of Mrs. Carson. Ben Carson's brother became an engineer. And Ben went from being ranked the worst student in his 5th grade class to being named head of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins University, or Johns Hopkins Hospital, when he was 33 years of age, the youngest in the nation to have such a position. On the occasion of its 20th anniversary, the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., named Ben Carson one of the 89 living legends. And in 2001, Ben was chosen by CNN and Time magazine as one of America's top 20 physicians and scientists. And in 2016, he became a member of President Trump's cabinet and served as head of United States Housing and Urban Development. It all happened because of a mother's prayer. A mother that was in desperate situation. I too had a praying mother. She raised 3 boys, and she and my dad prayed for us every single day by name. And my mom would be specific. She would ask God to help her with our individual character flaws, and she would name them. Bert has this problem. Lord, I need help. And she asked that God would guide her as she directed us toward his will and plan for our lives. I would often hide around the corner just to listen to what she prayed to me, for me. I wanted to know what she was talking to God about me. And her prayers worked because my faith, as well as that of my brothers, was strengthened. And I've been serving the Lord as a pastor for over 55 years because Mom prayed. We are raising children and grandchildren in difficult days. But that is no reason to throw up our hands and to quit. Instead, like Hannah, who was in a desperate situation herself, did not despair, but she got down on her knees and prayed. And so you moms, you need to get on your knees and pray for your children. And then you need to give your children to the Lord. If you want to raise godly children in an ungodly age, you need to release them into God's hands and turn them completely over to him. That's what Hannah did. She vowed, she promised that she would give her son to the Lord all the days of his life. And sure enough, she did, verse 21. The next year, Elkanah and his family went to their annual trip to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and to keep his vow. But Hannah did not go. She told her husband, wait until the boy is weaned, and then I will take him to the tabernacle and leave him there with the Lord permanently. Whatever you think is best, Elkanah agreed. Stay here for now, and may the Lord help you keep your promise. So she stayed home and nursed the boy until he was weaned. Now, in that day, mothers nursed their babies until they were 3 years old or older. And so verse 24, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for a sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. And after sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. Sir, do you remember me? Hannah asked. I'm the very woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. And now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord his whole life. And they worshiped the Lord there. Now Samuel served the Lord in the tabernacle from the time he was 3 years old. Hannah gave up her boy to the Lord at a very young age. And you know, that's what we must do as well. You need to give your children and grandchildren to the Lord as soon as you can. Now, don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean that you bring your children to your pastor and ask him to raise them for you. That's not the point of this passage. But rather, you need to tell God that from your perspective, your children belong to him, not to you. They're just on loan from God to you, and you're giving them back to him. And you need to tell God that he has the freedom to do whatever he wants to do with them, whatever is in his plan, whatever is in his will. And then you do whatever you can to point your children to God. And you do whatever you can to lead your children to faith in Jesus Christ. And you do whatever you can to encourage your children to follow Christ with all of their heart. And at the very least, you should bring them to church every single week, whether they want to come or not. Now, I'm sure Samuel, at age 3, did not want to be left at the tabernacle. And he probably went kicking and screaming. But his mother knew what had to be done, and she did it. And so many parents today are afraid of their children. They're afraid that their children will rebel, and they're afraid that their children will hate them if they insist on certain rules. Well, just the opposite. Research has found that to be untrue. A few years ago, New York Magazine ran an article about a research concerning children and morality. And one researcher noted this: children who go wild and get in trouble have parents who don't set rules or standards. Their parents are loving and accepting no matter what the child does. But the children take the lack of rules as a sign that their parents don't care, that their parents don't want the job of being the parent. Ironically, he said, parents who are consistent in enforcing rules are also the warmest parents and have the most conversations with their children. The article went on to say that although some rules resulted in arguments between parents and their teens, the teenagers did not consider those conflicts harmful to the relationship they had with their parents. You see, deep down inside, our children want and need our guidance. They want to know that we care enough to enforce reasonable standards of right and wrong. And so don't be afraid to point your children and grandchildren to the Lord. And don't be afraid to insist that they come to church with you at least once a week. Don't be afraid to set guidelines and enforce them. They may not appreciate them now, but later they'll rise up and call you blessed. Believe me, I've been there. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to control and manipulate your children. If you truly give your children and your grandchildren to the Lord, you'll not only point them to Christ, but you'll turn them over to Christ. You see, when Hannah took her son to the tabernacle, in essence, she relinquished all control over him. She literally put him in the Lord's hands. And so often, when children make bad choices, parents feel that they have to take things into their own hands and take over and control them. They feel that they have to fix them. And then they get frustrated and angry when the children don't want to be fixed and resist them. Giving your children to the Lord means letting the Lord fix them. Now, you do what you can to advise them and to discipline them. But if they fail your warnings, you turn them over to the Lord. And you let the Lord teach them through some of the hard lessons that come when an individual makes poor choices. If your children are in rebellion, don't tear your hair out trying to fix them yourself. Give them over to the Lord. Relinquish control to the Lord and say, God, I give you the control of my son or daughter. You change their heart, oh God. You change their heart. Margaret Cannell of Tacoma, Washington, participates in the prayer ministry of her church, the Clover Creek Bible Fellowship. The prayer time always follows the Sunday services each week when people come down to the front to receive prayer for a variety of reasons. And one Sunday, a woman named Mary came forward for physical healing. Her right ear was filled with fluid, and her doctors couldn't figure out why, nor could they come up with any effective treatment that was helping. And as a result, Mary's hearing was getting worse and worse, and she was often dizzy and couldn't walk straight. Well, this had been going on for over a month. She was discouraged, and so she came forward one Sunday and asked for prayer. Now, the prayer team wisely asked God to speak to them about how to pray for Mary. They wanted God to show them whether Mary's illness had some spiritual causes or if it was just purely physical. And so the more they talked with Mary, they received the impression that her physical condition had some spiritual roots. It resulted from a pattern of control and distrust. Out of fear and mistrust of the Lord's capacity to work, Mary would take things into her own hands, and she would try to make things turn out right on her own. And so as it came out, Mary had been trying to help a family member whom she loved dearly and whom she was trying to fix. This family member was making some poor choices. And Mary constantly told her what she needed to do. But the person didn't do it. And Mary got more and more frustrated and just all uptight and in knots. And the prayer team encouraged Mary to release her loved one into God's care and control. And she did. And then they began to pray for healing. And immediately a peace came over Mary, and she believed that her ear would be healed. And in time, her condition did gradually diminish. And in a few weeks, it was completely gone. You see, when we try to fix family members through manipulation and control, I'm going to take things into my own hands. I'm going to make this right. We only end up hurting ourselves. But when we relinquish the control of our children to the Lord, then He knows how to lead them down a right path. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't enforce reasonable standards. After all, God calls you and gives you the job as parents and grandparents. But understand, only He can be their Savior and Lord. And so if we want to raise godly children in an ungodly age, you need to pray for them fervently. And you need to give your children to the Lord. And who knows, maybe God will use one of those children to bring revival to our nation. Wouldn't that be great? Barbara Bush, the wife of President George H.W. Bush, was once speaking at Wellesley College when her husband was still in the White House. And in her speech, she was trying to encourage the young women to make their family a priority in their life as well as their career. And so she told them, Our successes in this society depends not on what happens in the White House, but on what happens inside your house. And that's good advice and something to remember, especially during these days. More important than who is in the White House is who you are as a mom in your own house. You need to pray for your children and give your children to the Lord. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the testimony of Hannah. What a godly woman. A woman who learned how to raise a son to bring revival in the land. I pray that we would have that same desire, that same passion, that same goal for our children. And like Hannah, I pray that we will pray for our children. And I pray that we will give them to the Lord and allow you to do whatever is in your plan and will for them. And this I pray in Jesus'